There is a specific kind of loneliness that has no name on a shelf, no diagnosis code, no support group meeting on Tuesday evenings in a church basement. It doesn't arrive with the sharp, clean edge of a breakup or the ceremonial weight of a funeral. It arrives the way fog arrives, slowly, without announcement, and only noticeable once you're already completely inside it. It is the loneliness of remembering someone who has no idea they still live in you. If you were born somewhere between the late 1970s and the mid-1980s, there is a very good chance you carry people inside you who have no idea they're still there. People whose voices you can still hear in a certain octave, whose laugh you could reconstruct from memory right now, in this moment, decades after the last time you actually heard it. You carry the ghost of a Tuesday afternoon, a specific stretch of road, a particular smell of someone's house, that combination of carpet and cooking and someone else's family that was, for a few years, as familiar to you as your own. And then, one day, not dramatically, not with any ceremony, they were just gone. No goodbye that meant anything, no final conversation where you both understood it was the last one. Just a slow, quiet fade, a number that stopped working, a face that stopped appearing at the corner you always walked past. And your brain, which had been quietly building an entire architecture around that person, suddenly found itself holding a door that opened to nothing. This is what it means to be a Xennial. To have been built psychologically and emotionally in the last era of human history when people could truly, completely disappear. And what I want to talk to you about today is not nostalgia. Nostalgia is soft. Nostalgia is what you feel about a TV show or a flavor of cereal. What you carry around this particular kind of loss is something heavier, something with more psychological weight and more clinical precision than nostalgia has ever earned the right to claim. What you carry is grief, unwitnessed, socially unrecognized, completely unprocessed grief. And the reason it still surfaces in the middle of a perfectly ordinary Tuesday when a song comes on or you drive past a parking lot that looks like another parking lot from 30 years ago is because your brain never got the signal that the story was over. Let's sit with that for a moment, because it matters. In 1989, a grief researcher named Kenneth Doka introduced a concept that at the time felt academic. He called it disenfranchised grief, the grief that society doesn't give you permission to feel, the losses that don't come with flowers on the doorstep or a week of bereavement leave, losses you're expected to absorb in silence, to fold quietly into yourself, and then continue moving through your life as though the weight doesn't exist. The death of a pre-digital friendship fits this framework so precisely it's almost uncomfortable. Nobody told you to grieve the girl from 6th grade when her family moved 2 towns over. There was no ritual, no gathering, no moment where the people around you acknowledged that something real had ended. You just went back to school on Monday and her desk was empty, and life moved forward the way life always moves forward, indifferently, without waiting for you to catch up. But here is what your brain was doing underneath that forward motion. Your brain, operating on the same neurological hardware it's been running for hundreds of thousands of years, doesn't actually distinguish between "she moved away" and "this relationship is complete." It only understands presence and absence. It only understands this person was here and now they are not. And when there is no resolution, no closure, no final exchange that signals the end of the chapter, your brain does what it is brilliantly, exhaustingly designed to do. It keeps the file open. Psychologists call this the Zeigarnik Effect, named after Soviet psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik, who discovered in the 1920s that the human mind clings to incomplete tasks with a grip far stronger than it ever applies to finished ones. Your brain devotes significantly more cognitive and emotional energy to unresolved situations than resolved ones. It is, in a very literal neurological sense, haunted by the unfinished. You are not haunted by the friends you properly said goodbye to. You are haunted by the ones who just vanished. Because your brain, on some quiet background process running beneath your conscious awareness, is still waiting for the story to end. Still holding the loop open just in case it gets one more piece of information that finally lets it close. And for Xennials, people who formed their most foundational social bonds in an era before any of those bonds could be digitally tracked, archived, or maintained, the number of open loops can be staggering. Think about how many people passed through your life between the ages of 8 and 18. The kid from your street who moved before high school. The friend from summer camp whose last name you can't fully remember. The person you talked to every single day for 3 years and then, when circumstances shifted, simply never talked to again. Not because of a fight, not because of a betrayal, just because the physical proximity that had been generating the relationship every day without either of you ever having to consciously choose it was suddenly gone. And without that proximity, there was no mechanism. There was no way to sustain something that had never been deliberately constructed in the first place. This is what psychologists call spontaneous prequinity, and it is one of the most quietly devastating things to understand about how your generation formed its emotional world. Prequinity, at its most basic, is the psychology of proximity. The research, beginning with Festinger, Schachter, and Bach's foundational 1950s study on housing communities, showed something that feels both obvious and profound once you understand its full weight. We don't primarily choose our closest relationships based on compatibility or shared values or matching personalities. We form our deepest bonds with the people we repeatedly, accidentally end up near. The person whose locker was next to yours. The family whose backyard touched your backyard. The kid whose bus stop was yours. Whose route home overlapped with yours. Who just kept appearing in your peripheral vision until one day they were no longer peripheral at all. For Xennials, this wasn't just how some friendships formed. This was the entire operating system. You didn't schedule connection. You didn't swipe toward it or algorithmically optimize for compatibility. You just showed up. At the 7-Eleven, at the skate park, at the particular corner where people seemed to gather for no articulable reason, and whoever was there was your world for the next 3 hours. The friendship wasn't a decision. It was a weather pattern. It happened around you, through you, because you were all just existing in the same physical air. And because it formed through presence rather than intention, it also held something that modern connection has largely been stripped of, something researchers now call situational intimacy. The kind of closeness that emerges not from deep disclosure or vulnerable conversation, but from shared, unremarkable time, from existing together without agenda. From the particular quality of silence that develops between two people who have spent enough hours in the same room doing nothing of consequence that the silence itself becomes a form of communication. That quality of presence, that specific texture of being known without performance, is what made those friendships feel so real. And it is also what made their disappearance feel so uniquely, silently devastating. Because here is the thing about a friendship built on physical presence. When the physical presence ends, there is nothing left to hold it in place. There is no chat history, no shared playlist, no documented thread of the inside jokes and the small moments and the accumulated evidence that this was real, that this meant something. There is only your memory. And your memory, over time, becomes the sole surviving record of something that was, at the time, your entire world. You became the sole custodian of a shared history that now exists in exactly one place. In you.
That is not nostalgia. That is a specific and documented form of cognitive and emotional isolation. You are carrying a relationship that no longer has a second party, a conversation that can never be continued, a story that stopped mid-sentence and for which no final page will ever be written. And the reason it surfaces with such unexpected force when you catch a smell or hear a song or drive through a neighborhood that looks nothing like the one you grew up in, but something about the light is the same, is because your memory of those people isn't stored the way you might store a phone number or a fact. It's stored proprioceptively, in your body, in the sensory texture of specific afternoons, in the quality of light at 4 p.m. on a Wednesday in October, in the particular sound of a telephone ringing in a house where you knew exactly who it would be. These are not memories of events, they are memories of states of being. And when something in your present environment rhymes with those states, when the sensory data is close enough, your nervous system doesn't distinguish between then and now. It simply opens the file. And you are suddenly, without warning, in the presence of someone who hasn't thought about you in 30 years. That asymmetry is one of the quiet cruelties of analog loss. They moved on with a clean break. Their brain received an ending because they were the ones who left. New school, new street, new people who quickly filled the physical proximity slots that you once occupied. Their Zeigarnik loop closed, maybe not immediately, but relatively cleanly. Their social architecture rebuilt itself around new materials. Yours didn't, because you were the one left behind. You were the one standing on the same corner with a gap where a person used to be. And your brain, loyal and relentless in the way that brains are, kept the gap exactly the shape of them, just in case they came back, just in case the story resumed. This is the mechanism. This is the psychology underneath the feeling. And if you've ever wondered why a specific song from 1993 can drop you into an emotional state that feels entirely disproportionate to what a song has any business making you feel, this is why. The song isn't the trigger. The song is just the key. What it's unlocking is a file your brain has been quietly maintaining for decades, fully indexed, completely intact, waiting for precisely this moment to remind you that somewhere, in some version of your internal landscape, you are still standing on that corner, waiting for someone who doesn't know you're waiting. And here's where it gets even more precise. Because what you lost wasn't just the person. What you lost was the version of yourself that existed in relation to them.
There is a psychological concept called the relational self, the idea that who we are is never fully separable from who we are with. You were not the same person with your mother as you were with your best friend from the block. You were not the same person in the classroom as you were in that parking lot at dusk. We are, in some deeply biological sense, partially constructed by our relationships. We exist, in part, through the eyes of specific people who knew us at specific moments. When those people disappear, you don't just lose them. You lose the version of yourself that only ever existed in their presence, the self that laughed at things only they would understand, the self that didn't have to explain its references or perform its history. That version of you, unguarded, unaudited, completely real, quietly goes with them. And nobody names that loss either. Nobody hands you a ceremony for the self you were at 14 in the presence of someone who no longer exists in your life to confirm that that person was ever real. But here is the reframe, and I want you to stay with this because this is the part that changes everything. The depth of what you feel when a name surfaces from 30 years ago is not dysfunction. It is not a failure to move on. It is direct and irrefutable evidence of how completely, how humanly you were present in those relationships when they were happening. You were not performing. You were not documenting. You were not curating yourself for an audience. You were simply entirely there. And that quality of presence, unrepeatable, unrecorded, given freely without a single metric to justify it, is one of the rarest things a human being can offer another human being in the modern world. The grief is not the wound. The grief is the proof. You loved people the way humans were built to love, through time and shared silence and the slow accumulation of ordinary, unremarkable moments that meant everything precisely because they were never meant to mean anything at all. That is not a flaw in your wiring. That is the whole point of being alive. If this reached something in you that hasn't been touched in a long time, you are not alone. Stay in the conversation.